So for me, if one looks at a society, there are always ailments in a society, whether it's poverty, inequality challenges, unemployment, low growth rates. You require, though, an understanding of the size and shape, and my personal bias is an empirical size and shape of the challenge in order to do anything about it. So if you don't understand the distribution of unemployment rates across the country or by age or by gender, it's very difficult to even design policy. So that's what moves me, is starting from the first stage of understanding empirically the size and shape of the societal challenge that you're faced with. So formally, I'm a professor of economics at the University of Cape Town. So I am employed by UCT in the School of Economics. But as many academics do, I run an institute called the Development Policy Research Unit. And that's where the rump of my work occurs, which is around doing policy work for both local and international organizations around issues of poverty, growth, inequality, labor markets. So a typical piece of work would be a request comes from a multilateral organization, the World Bank, a local government department, even a foreign donor, requesting a piece of work to be done around a labor market issue. So can you do a piece of research on understanding youth unemployment trends in Zambia? Would be a really typical example. We would then be commissioned to do that work. The modus operandi of that work is everywhere and always the use of large micro data sets, as we call it, so survey data, because our advantage as economists is to use empirical methods, so econometric methods and other sort of statistical methods to understand the size and shape of the challenge. What are the determinants of youth unemployment? How do you fix it? Policy options and so on. So the way to think about this, if we go back to 94 or even 5-10 years before democracy, is South Africa has experienced and be almost the poster child of being in what we call a middle income country growth trap. So we've experienced persistently low levels of mediocre growth rates. And by this, I mean, if you take the period 1985, 86 through to the present day, South Africa has grown at a GDP per capita level of 0.29 per year every year for about 40 years. As a comparator, China has grown by 8% every year for 40 years, right? So we very much, and if you look at the distribution of middle income countries, South Africa sits at the bottom of that group, right, in terms of being in this sort of low growth trap. The consequence of that, right, is that it's made it very, very difficult for us as a society, as an economy, to actually significantly reduce poverty levels. So the one thing we know, economists disagree about a lot of things, but the one lemma we have is that if you keep the distribution of income constant, if you have high levels of growth, poverty will fall. So we have seen some reduction in poverty levels in South Africa post-94, but not sufficiently large, and that's principally because of our anemic growth levels. Inequality as a consequence has remained stubbornly high. So we know the statistics, it's worth repeating, we're the most unequal society in the world, and that hasn't changed. So the one really important thing to keep in mind is that excessively high inequality levels are actually bad for growth. So the dynamic is a negative dynamic, right? So in the sense that, and perhaps one very simple, pure way to think about this is that very high inequality levels means that you have a very low tax base, right? Because you've got very, very few high income earners in a society and large numbers there's a long tail in the distribution, large numbers of low income earners. And so those people working, those people earning income and paying taxes is actually a very small number. That's not good for growth, it's not good for fiscal policy, it's not good for infrastructure investment from the public sector and so on. The labor market mirror of the sort of high inequality levels, or if you like, stubborn poverty levels with anemic growth, is in fact very high unemployment rates. Now, the interesting thing about this, and perhaps this is a little bit of the new work we're doing, is yes, we are used to the fact that we've got on average over the since 1994, an unemployment rate of about 25%. So that's well known. And yes, during the COVID years, it sort of went above 30 and now it's come down. But the thing we often don't couple, right, in terms of the empirics, when we look at these very high unemployment rates, is the equally important statistic that if you look at informality, so if you look at the share of workers in the informal sector and you take the distribution of middle-income countries, South Africa is right at the bottom. So here's the interesting coupling of data, is that we've got in the distribution of middle-income countries, we've got the highest unemployment rate. Take that same set of countries and look at informality and we're at the bottom end. So what does that mean? And if you look at the growth employment conversion, we have low growth rates, yes, but our ability to generate jobs from admittedly low growth rates is no different from other middle income countries. So we're not particularly bad at generating jobs with a given level of growth rates, right? Our problem, it's a very strange problem, is that most of these countries close their labor market or resolve, if you like, not deliberately, but resolve the jobless problem is to allow large numbers of people into the informal sector. And we don't do that. So if you look at the ratio of, in the classic middle income country, of wage employed to the informal sector to the unemployed, it's 45, 45, 10. So for every 100 people in the labor market, 45 are in wage employment, 45 in the informal sector, and 10 in unemployment. Now for South Africa, the first number, the wage employed, is actually 50. So then you'd think, well, if we continue with that ratios, we should have a much larger number of people, in the informal sector. But actually it goes from 50 to 16, not 45, 16, and then 34. So in fact, that's the real, if you like, maldistribution in the labor market. It's not that we have too few wage employed people, it's that we have too few people in the informal sector. It's a very strange phenomenon. We have too few people in the informal sector. And so the obtuse outcome, and I think it's a consequence of our very strange history, right, of apartheid, of exclusion, of spatial segregation, the obtuse public policy conclusion is actually you need to allow the informal sector to operate more freely. And we haven't learned, we actually have to learn how to do that. Because countries didn't, it's as if, that's the strangeness, it's as if you plonked pre-apartheid, pre-94, you plonked European and North American legislation, which is what we did, on a developing country. I mean, that never happened in India or Paraguay or Brazil or Argentina. So they had developing country legislation and understanding of labor markets that was more orientated towards developing countries. So 94 comes and then you inherit this structure which says keep the informal sector away, you need licensing, you need all this sort of thing, and it's better, bigger is better, you must be formal, you must be in a mall. And that's not how development happens, right? But we don't know any better. We have to almost learn how to do that. And that's a difficult conversation to have with regulators and policymakers, because they want the streets clean and they want the cities to be organized. That's sort of the planner's mentality almost. Whereas the way in which you close the labor market and get to that 45%, right, in the informal sector is to allow the chaos. You actually have to, right? Otherwise you sit with the problems we have, right, which is 25% plus unemployment rate. So if you think about whether it's low growth rates and the inability to convert that to sufficient reductions in poverty, inequality, and reductions in unemployment, the state's response since 1994 has been principally and understandably focused on households. So whether it's social grants or at least the infrastructure for water and energy. I know the supply has broken down dramatically in the last 5 years, but the infrastructure was rolled out. Housing as well, quite significantly and positively so post-94 in the first sort of decade. But that's effectively a policy orientation towards households. I think it's really important that the state looks at pivoting to supporting firms and enterprises. And it's what I call supply-side economics of a good type, right? And that really means focusing on firms across the distribution of firm sizes. So that means everybody from the informal sector operator right through to the large listed firm. Think of it as a grid, right? So if you think of columns where you've got different size classes of firms, so you've got the small survivalist enterprise, you've got the micro enterprise, you've got the medium registered firm, right through the large one. Those are your columns. And think of the matrix having rows, which refers to policy categories. Like, let me give you an example. So one policy category would be regulation. The second one could be infrastructure. The third could be what I call supply-side incentives. Let's take regulation. For the informal sector operator, in each of those columns, the regulatory intervention is actually very specific. It's about removing these local government regulations on where you can operate, the license fees that you need to pay, which I think moves are to remove that. Regulation that mandates the city to provide storage facilities, for example. But for the large firms, the regulation may be very different. In fact, it is, right? They're not interested in local government regulation. For a large firm, it could be around, say, procurement rules. It could be tax laws. For medium enterprises, it's very clear that the labor legislative environment may be the one that you want to rethink. And so it's important in designing a policy matrix that you targeted at firms. Very important to stop seeing, I think we have ideological hangover of seeing firms as not sort of deserving of policy support. It's always got to be about household and social grants. Equally important, but firms generate 9 out of 10 jobs in any economy around the world. Nobody else does, right? So you better think about incentivizing firms, creating an enabling environment for firms to actually grow and generate employment. But it has to be targeted, and it has to be size-specific and sector-specific. It's a difficult question to answer simply because in most economies, the private sector responds to incentives or disincentives, right? So as long as, to use the hackneyed phrase, there's an enabling environment, policy environment for the private sector, they will choose to invest. And if they invest, either building a plant, green or brownfield type investment, what will end up happening is you'll get growth, you'll get jobs, and so the cycle carries on. So one could argue that the private sector doesn't need to do anything, right? Simply because if the environment is correct for them, they will come. Capital will be allocated accordingly, either domestic or foreign, and investment will flow and so on. I guess a little bit less traditionally, one can think of a scenario where if the private sector does face constraints, right, to operating, they could be looking at other mechanisms for closing those obstacles or constraints. So the classic example would be a skills constraint, right? So here, it is important for the private sector to think more creatively about accessing those skills. Now, the skills can be accessed, if we take that specific example, either domestically or from abroad. Now, domestically, yes, there's a steady supply of individuals coming through the university system for the requisite needs, and that's the TVET system as well as the classic university system, but there's a funding crisis, right? And there's also a signaling challenge. So universities may not know exactly the skills that are required from the private sector. The private sector's possible role, more active role, although they are engaged, to actually work more closely with universities in identifying what those skills needs are in the first hand, and then secondly, to actually possibly fund more vigorously bursary programs and so on to ensure and secure the supply of those skills. I don't think that happens sufficiently. I think it's currently the private sector is possibly a little bit too passive in thinking creatively about how to source those kinds of skilled individuals and be proactive in sourcing them. So that would be one very specific example. The other one is if one thinks about the structure of the economy where you've got large, world-class, dominant, globally competitive firms, there should be ways in which they could integrate their, and I think a lot of firms are already doing that, but their supply and procurement mandates with and together with and explicitly with small and medium enterprises. I think the BE legislation pushes them in that direction, but that could be a really important mechanism for creatively and in a more structured way accessing and growing small and medium enterprises. The final one, if one goes back to the skills example, is if there's a need for skills abroad, we have a particularly onerous, scarce skills legislative environment. I think the private sector tries, through its mandated organizations, to engage with government in changing the legislation around work permits, scarce skills, and so on. But again, my suspicion is that a more creative, and I would argue evidence-based interaction can and should happen with government on a variety of these kinds of constraints that they're facing. So I think that's happened with the scarce skills and the immigration issue, but I don't think it's happened sufficiently on a whole range of other obstacles that business faces.